1 copper, that's all he paid. The crowd laughed, the auctioneer smirked, but when the orc with a sack over her head finally spoke, the farmer in the dusty coat went completely still. He had heard that voice before. The spring sun hit red stone hard that day. Red dust rose in short spirals between the boots of the men gathered around the makeshift platform. There were calloused hand farmers, narrow-eyed bounty hunters, and Valdrak frontier guards leaning against dark wooden posts. Everyone was looking at the center. On the platform, she stood. The orc's vivid green skin was coated in trail dust. Her bare feet pressed directly against the rough planks. Her pointed ears trembled slightly in the warm wind. Her wrists were bound in front of her with raw leather rope, and over her head, a tied sack hid her face from the world. The auctioneer was a short, fat man in a faded, wine-colored vest with a rusted badge on his chest. He paced back and forth as if this were a celebration. "Opening bid! 1 copper!" he shouted, spreading his arms wide. "Who wants to do business?" The crowd laughed. Someone tossed a small stone near her feet. She did not move. Her fingers contracted and relaxed, in a slow and controlled rhythm, as if she were counting something inside her own head. The auctioneer kept talking, describing the orc as strong, young, useful for heavy labor. He never said her name. She had not spoken a single word since the mountains of Gorath, he announced with the voice of a man selling cattle. At the edge of the crowd, a tall man watched everything in silence. He wore a leather coat worn at the seams, a wide-brimmed hat tilted over his forehead, and boots that had seen plenty of mud. His name was Darren Tyle, and he was a farmer on a clearing 2 hours down the trail. He lived alone. He planted, harvested, mended fences. He spoke little. He had no enemies and no close friends. He was looking at the platform with a strange expression on his face. It was not pity, it was not curiosity. It was something he could not quite name, like when you pass through a place and feel certain you have been there before, even knowing you have not. A small, persistent feeling that settles in the throat and does not leave. Darren pulled his hand from his pocket and lightly touched the inner lining of his coat. Something was there. A folded cloth. Old, that he had carried for years. His fingers found the embroidered fabric and stopped. He did not understand why he did that at that moment. The orc on the platform did not move. The sun beat down on the leather sack over her head. The rope at her wrists was tight enough to leave red marks on her green skin. The auctioneer called for bids again. No one stepped forward seriously. There were laughs, short comments, no real offers. Darren narrowed his eyes under the brim of his hat. His feet began to move before he had made any conscious decision. Darren walked to the front with firm steps. The crowd parted, more out of surprise than respect. He stopped before the platform, looked at the auctioneer, and said in a calm voice, 1 copper. The auctioneer blinked. 1 copper, he repeated, almost laughing. That's what you asked for. There were murmurs around him. The auctioneer recovered quickly and opened a smile of yellow teeth. "Want to see what you're buying, friend? I can lift the sack for a moment, show you." "No." Darren placed the coin in the man's hand, without hesitating. "I'm not buying a face. I'm marrying a person." The air stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Some men in the crowd laughed with discomfort. Others went genuinely quiet. The auctioneer looked at the coin in his palm, then at Darren, then at the platform. "I need her name in the record book," the auctioneer said at last, pulling a grimy notebook from under his arm. Darren signed his portion with a steady hand. Then he waited. The silence lasted longer than it should have. The orc on the platform did not move. Her fingers still contracted and relaxed. Then she spoke. The voice came out dry, deep, firm as old wood that does not bend. "Vronyara." Darren did not react with surprise. He did not smile, did not nod. He simply climbed the 2 steps of the platform, pulled the small knife from his belt, and cut the rope at her wrists with a single motion. He did not remove the sack from her head. He did not ask anything. "When you want to leave, the path is open," he said quietly, only for her to hear. "When you want to stay, there's a roof and food." Vrognyara stood still for a moment. Then she stepped down from the platform on her own, without help, her bare feet touching the red earth. Daran walked ahead. She followed a few steps behind, the sack still on her head, her free hands swinging lightly at her sides. The crowd stayed behind. The murmurs stayed behind too. The trail leading to Daran's farm moved away from Redstone between black oaks, with roots that cracked the earth in irregular patterns. The wind between the leaves made a low sound, almost like breathing. Light filtered through the branches in golden pieces. Daran did not try to make conversation. Vrognyara did not try either. They walked like that for 2 hours. The sun dropped slowly. The trail dust gave way to damp moss between the stones. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was heavy in a different way, like two strangers who already know each other without yet knowing how. At the final bend in the trail, the clearing opened up. The farm was dark wood, solid and quiet. There was a low fence around a vegetable garden, a small barn, a stone stove visible through the open window, nothing luxurious, everything necessary. Daran stopped at the entrance and waited. Vrognyara stood still a few steps behind, her head covered, her pointed ears tilted slightly forward, as if she were listening to the place before deciding to enter it. Daran pushed the farmhouse door open and walked in without ceremony. He left the door open behind him. Vrognyara waited outside for a moment. Then she stepped in. The inside was simple, a thick wooden table with 2 benches, a shelf with clay pots lined up in a row, tools hanging on the wall, a dark stone stove in the corner, cold at that moment. She moved away from the door and crouched with her back to the main room, pressing against the side wall with her knees bent. The sack still covered her head. Her small, discreet tusks were clenched. Daran said nothing about it. He went straight to the stone stove, lit it with ignite stones taken from a small tin box, and began working in silence. He pulled roots from the clay basket, dried meat hanging from a beam, a cast-iron pot that clinked lightly against the stove before settling. Water from a clay jug. Steam began rising slowly, and the smell of warm broth gradually filled the room. Earthy, salty, familiar. Vrognyara, with her back to him, turned her head slightly. Daran prepared 2 bowls. He set one on the floor near her, without forcing contact, without telling her where she should be. Then he sat on the bench with his own bowl and began eating slowly. Vrognyara stared at the bowl on the floor for a long time. "What is this?" she asked. The voice was still dry, but there was something different in it now, less armored. "Root broth with dried meat," said Daran without lifting his eyes. "It's not much, but it warms you." "Why 2 portions?" He stopped his spoon for a second, then kept eating. "Always make 2, he said. "Old habit. My wife died of fever 3 years ago. I never stopped making her portion. It sits on the table for a while, and then I eat it cold before sleeping." Vrognyara did not answer immediately. The fire crackled low in the stove. Outside, a dark, feathered bird landed on the sill of the open window and stayed for a moment before flying away. She reached for the bowl on the floor, held it with both hands. Under the sack, she tilted her face slightly to the side, found the rim with her mouth and drank slowly. She did not say it was good. She did not thank him, but she emptied the bowl to the last drop. Daran collected the bowls afterward. He washed them in a basin of water he brought from the well out back. The afternoon wind came through the still open door and carried the smell of damp earth and old leaves. Vrognyara stayed in her position for a while longer. Then, slowly, she moved to the bench closest to the wall and sat on it with her back straight and her arms resting on her knees. She still had not removed the sack, but she was inside the house. And for that night, that was enough for both of them. That night the fire died slowly in the stone stove's embers. Vrognyara had fallen asleep on the bench, leaning against the wall, the sack still on her head, tilted to one side. Daran covered her with a thick wool blanket without making a sound. He went to sit on the opposite bench, facing the embers. The low heat made shadows dance across the wooden planks on the wall, and in that stillness the memory returned, as it always returned when the fire was nearly dead and the silence became too complete. 3 years ago, the most brutal winter the slopes of Gorath had seen in a generation, Daran had left the safe trail chasing an animal he had spotted moving between the trees. The black snow of the mountains was falling heavy, and he had not noticed how far he had strayed from the known limits. When he noticed, the ground gave way beneath his feet on an ice-covered slope. The fall lasted only seconds. The pain lasted much longer. He woke with his leg broken at the wrong angle, snow accumulating around his body, the cold entering his bones like needles. He cried out. No one answered. The silence of Gorath was the kind that swallowed sound whole. Then she appeared, an orc, with her face covered by a tied cloth, her eyes visible above the fabric, carrying bundles of sticks on her back. She looked at him for a moment, then dropped the sticks, knelt in the snow without hesitating, and began dragging him. She said nothing. She just acted. The shamanic cave was less than 100 meters down the slope, small, low, with walls covered in symbols scratched in charcoal. She lit a fire with ignite stones, pulled from a small leather pouch tied to her belt. She prepared a bitter tea from black oak bark, making him drink it in slow sips, and she prayed. The prayers were whispered in orc tongue that he did not understand, but their rhythm was as steady as a heartbeat, and the fire grew with each cycle. Daran slept for hours. When he woke, the pain in his leg had eased enough for him to sit up. The orc was gone. On the cave floor, folded with care, was a cloth of beige fabric, embroidered with purple flowers in irregular stitching, thick thread. Without perfection, but firm. He tucked it into the lining of his coat that morning and never took it out. Now, facing the dying embers, Daran touched the coat's lining with his fingers. Vronyara's voice sounded in his head, dry, deep, firm, the same voice that had prayed in orc tongue in a winter cave while he slept with fever. He did not need to see her face. He did not need any proof. He knew who she was. The embers went out completely. The room went dark. Outside, the wind in the black oak leaves made that low, slow sound that sounded like breathing. Daran stood up, went to the bedroom, and lay down without removing his coat. The mist arrived before the sun that morning. It was purple and dense, the kind that the mountains of Gorath sent down to the Valdrak frontier when winter had not quite given up. It crept between the black oaks and covered the clearing floor like a living carpet. Vronyara woke early. The farmhouse was still quiet. She went out through the back door without making a sound. She walked through the mist to the nearest black oak by the fence and sat down among its exposed roots, her back against the wide trunk. For a long time, she simply stayed there. Then, with slow movements, she raised her hands and untied the knot of the sack. The cold morning air touched her face all at once. Her vivid green skin prickled slightly. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Once, twice, letting the cold in. Inside, Daran had woken and was standing at the kitchen window with a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He could see Vronyara's back through the purple mist between the trees, but he did not go to her. He stayed where he was. After a while, he spoke loud enough for the mist to carry his words. I was once saved by an orc in the mountains. She had her face covered. I never saw who she was. Vronyara did not answer right away. The mist shifted between them. I know, she said at last. Daran did not ask how she knew. He was the kind of man who understood when a sentence was complete. Vronyara removed the sack entirely and set it down beside her on the damp earth. The scar was deep. It ran from her left temple to her chin in a line that was not straight. It was the mark of a blade, held in anger, not in precision. The skin around it was darker, old with years. She did not hide it. She sat with her face open to the cold air. "The owner of an inn in Gorath," she said slowly. "He harassed me. I refused. He came at me in the night." A pause. He did not get up again. The wind in the leaves made that low breathing sound. "They sold me as a criminal," Vrognara continued. "They put the sack on, so no one would judge what they saw before they heard the price. They wanted me to be worth less than a face would earn." Daran drank his tea in silence. "You went for 1 copper," he said at last in a dry voice. Vrognara turned her head slightly in his direction. "That was the minimum asked. It was all I had available at the moment," he said. "I would be lying if I said otherwise." She looked at him for a moment, then turned her face back to the mist. There was no smile, but something in her shoulders relaxed slightly, a small weight that let go without making a sound. The sun began to pierce the purple mist in thin golden threads. The black oaks appeared one by one in the growing light, and Vrognara sat with her face open until the mist disappeared completely. Vrognara walked into the farmhouse that morning and found something on the table that had not been there before. A small oval silver mirror with a simple frame and an old scratch on the edge. Beside it, a faded silk scarf, a colour that had once been white and was now a soft beige, with dark edges worn by use and time. There was no note. There was no gesture. The things were simply there. Daran was in the barn when she found them. She could hear the sound of tools out there. Vrognara stood in front of the table for a long time, looking at the mirror without sitting. Then she pulled the bench slowly and sat down. The mirror was small enough to show only the face. She lifted it with both hands and looked. The vivid green face with the deep scar looked back. She did not look away. She did not frown. She simply stayed there, looking, like someone who needs to make sure that what they are seeing is real. With her free hand, she traced the scar with the tips of her fingers. From temple to chin, the whole path, slowly. It was not the gesture of someone mourning a mark. It was the gesture of someone touching something that belongs to them, something that is part of their story and cannot be erased. She lowered the mirror. She picked up the silk scarf. The fabric was soft between her fingers, finer than anything she had ever worn. She folded it carefully and placed it over her head with slow movements, tying it loosely at the back of her neck. It was not the sack. It did not cover her face. It only framed it like a border. She chose to put it on. The farmhouse door opened and Daran came in carrying the smell of sawdust and earth. He saw Vrognara sitting with the scarf on her head and paused for a second. "That belonged to my wife," he said with a calm voice. "She wore it when she worked in the garden. It stayed in the chest after she was gone. I didn't know what to do with it." Vrognara did not answer immediately. She lifted the mirror again, this time holding it steady on the table rather than in front of her face, beside her, as if placing her own image within a larger context. Then slowly, she turned the mirror to face forward and pressed her open palm against the glass. It was not to check what she saw. It was something else, like touching the wall of a house for the first time to know if it is real, like finding something that was lost and holding it carefully, afraid to let go. Daran went to heat water without saying anything more, and Vrognara stayed there, with her hand on the mirror and the silk scarf on her head, inside a dark wooden farmhouse on the Valdrak frontier, feeling for the first time in a long while that the face looking back at her was her own, and that this alone was enough. The bounty hunter arrived in Red Stone 3 weeks after the morning of the purple mist. His name was Cord. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scorched leather coat and 2 revolvers on his belt, one on each side. He was not the kind of man who asked politely. He was the kind who already knew the answer before opening his mouth and only wanted to confirm what he was looking for. He walked into the Redstone General Store and showed a folded paper to the man behind the counter. The paper had a handwritten description. Orc with vivid green skin, deep scar from temple to chin. criminal's face, blood in her past. The man behind the counter said nothing, but a boy who had overheard the conversation ran down the trail to Daran's farm. Daran was fixing a beam in the barn when the boy arrived breathless and told everything in short, stumbling sentences. Daran listened to the end. He sent the boy home with a loaf of rye bread and walked into the farmhouse. Vronyara was sitting at the table, sharpening a small bone knife with a flat stone. She looked up when he came in. He told her everything without going around it. Vronyara stopped sharpening. She stared at the knife for a moment. "How long until he gets here?" she asked. "A day. 2 at most." She set the knife on the table, then went to the leather chest in the corner of the room and opened it. Inside, among cloths and dried herbs tied with twine, was the raw leather sack. She took it out and held it in front of her for a moment, looking at it. "I'll wear it one more time," she said with a firm voice. "Not to hide, to move without being seen." Daran crossed his arms. What's the plan?" Vronyara thought for a moment, her eyes moving across the mental map of the region she had built during weeks of silent walks along the frontier. "I ride east, through the Valdrak canyons. Visible enough for him to follow. You go to the frontier warden and tell him what you know about Cord. There are warrants on him in 2 territories, if I remember right from what I heard in Red Stone." Daran nodded. The plan was simple. Simple usually worked. The next morning, Vronyara rode out on Daran's horse before dawn, the sack on her head and the silk scarf folded in her pocket. Cord found her through the Valdrak canyons by late afternoon. It was far too easy, and that should have been a warning to him. It was not. The frontier warden was waiting for Cord at the canyon exit, with 2 armed men and the warrants in hand. Vronyara dismounted, untied the sack for the last time, and held it in her open hands, looking at it in the golden afternoon light. "It saved me," she said quietly to herself. "Not by hiding me, but because I used it when I needed to." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket beside the silk scarf. The letter arrived 6 days after Cord was taken by the frontier guards. It was a heavy paper envelope with the seal of the Valdrak Council pressed in dark wax. Daran found it pinned to the farmhouse door early in the morning, when there was still thin frost on the porch planks. He handed it to Vronyara without opening it. She sat at the table, broke the seal, and unfolded the letter with slow movements. She read it once, then read it again, more slowly. The sender's name was Agnia Torvin, a cook who had worked at the Gorath Inn years before. She had been in the kitchen that night, the letter said. She had heard everything through the thin wall. She had seen the owner heading toward Vronyara's room with a knife tucked under his apron. She had stayed silent out of fear for years. Now she had sent her written testimony to the Valdrak Council. The charges against Vronyara were withdrawn. Vronyara read the last line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, her open palm pressed flat on top. Like someone sealing something shut, Daran was standing in the kitchen doorway, cup of tea in hand. "Good news," she said at last. It was not a question. "Seems so," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she raised her head and looked out the window. There in the clearing stood a dark wood arch that Daran had built in the last few days between 2 trees. 2 posts driven into the ground. A horizontal beam, black oak branches woven along the sides, simple, solid. She had pretended not to notice it. Now she looked at it carefully. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you want," said Daran. The day they chose was 3 days later. The morning brought clean sun and a soft wind that moved the black oak leaves with that low breathing sound. Vronyara spent the morning in her room. When she came out, she wore a cream dress sewn by hand with irregular stitches she herself had made over the past weeks, using fabric bought in Red Stone. At the neckline and sleeves, small crystal adornments that she had collected during her walks along the frontier. Translucent stones that caught the light and scattered it in fragments. On her head, she had placed the raw leather sack. But it was no longer the same sack. In the days before, it had been washed with oak water, bleached in the sun until it lost its dirty colour, and then embroidered by hand with purple flowers along the edges, the same thick and irregular stitch as the cloth she had left in the Gorath cave years ago, when she saved a farmer she did not yet know. Now it was a veil. Now it was a choice. Daran was standing under the arch when she walked toward him across the open clearing. "It doesn't matter what covered your face," he said when she reached him. "You were always the woman I chose." The wedding was small, as their life had been until then. No elaborate ceremony, no crowd, no loud celebration. The frontier warden, a rough-voiced man named Torvin Bak, had arrived early in the morning with the record book under his arm and 2 guards who stood respectfully apart among the trees. Daran and Vrognara stood under the dark wood arch, with hands intertwined, while Torvin Bak read the registry words aloud, as was the custom on the Valdrak frontier. When he finished, Vrognara removed the embroidered veil of purple flowers and folded it carefully over her arms. The vivid green face with the deep scar was open to the morning sun. She did not put it back on. There was no longer any need for covering, neither imposed nor chosen. The weeks that followed were of shared work and shared silence. Vrognara learned the rhythm of the farm, when to plant, when to harvest, when the stone stove needed new wood. Daran learned her rhythm, that she woke before the sun, that she preferred to work without conversation in the mornings, that at night she sometimes went out to sit under the black oak and pray in orc tongue with a low voice, eyes closed and fingers touching the crystals sewn into her dress. He never interrupted those prayers. She never explained what she asked for. A month after the wedding, Vrognara began building something at the edge of the clearing. Daran noticed she was gathering flat stones of a specific kind, black ones with irregular white veins. She stacked them carefully in a pattern he did not recognize, spreading a dark mortar that smelled of oak bark and something older still. "What is that?" he asked one afternoon. "An altar," she said without stopping her work, "for the ancestors of the Den clan, so they know where I am." Daran looked at it for a moment. "And the wife I lost to fever," he said slowly. "Mine. Can she be part of it?" Vrognara paused. She looked at him over her shoulder. "The ancestors make no distinction of race," she said. "Only of honor." "She had honor," said Daran. "Then she's already here," Vrognara answered, turning back to her work. The altar was finished on an afternoon of orange sky that made the Valdrak frontier look like it was made of embers and honey. Vrognara lit a small flame in a stone bowl at the center of the structure and prayed for a long time, her voice low and steady as the wind between the oaks. Daran stood beside her, quiet, until the flame went out on its own. That night, as the stone stove crackled low and the wind made its breathing sound in the leaves outside, Vrognara said to the ceiling, "There is something in the Valdrak canyons. I felt it when I rode out there for Cord." Daran opened one eye. "The kind of thing that needs attention, the kind of thing that warns before it arrives," she said. "It is still far." He closed his eye again. "Then we rest first." The fire kept crackling. Outside, deep in the Valdrak canyons, something ancient and dark pulsed slowly among the stones. Still distant, still quiet, but alive.